Welcome to the PIO podcast. I am your host, Robert Tornabene. I have been a PIO for over 11 years with 27 years of law enforcement background. Welcome to season 2 of the PIO podcast. I am working hard to bring you the very most diverse crowd of subject matter experts in the public sector field. You can help grow the podcast by sharing it with friends and colleagues. Please give the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you listen to. So sit back and enjoy our next episode. Today on the PIO podcast, we have Warren Weeks from Weeks Media. Warren, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Robert. Thanks for having me here.
I really appreciate you coming on. You are a communications professional. You've been doing this for quite a while, and you're highly regarded for things that you do out there, particularly in your media training. Let's talk about your background and how you and why you conduct media training.
I guess the short answer is I conduct media training because so few people do it really well. I started out as a journalist. I won't give everybody the long, boring version of this, but I went to journalism school, wanted to be a journalist. I ended up flipping over to corporate communications a few years later, and I didn't even know media training existed. And I sat in on a session and I was asked to be, they do simulated interviews, right? And I was asked to be the journalist who called in and pretended to do an interview with someone and make it realistic and test them out. And a light bulb went off in my mind. I think that was like in 1998 or something like that. And I thought, this is what I want to do with my career. And it took me quite some time to get to the point where I'm doing it full time, but that's basically where I've been for about the last decade or so.
Okay, great. So what are some of the common mistakes that the media, let me rephrase this. What are five of the most common media interview mistakes and how can they be overcome?
Right. So to boil these down to 5, let's see the 5 most common that I see. First of all, some of them are tactical and some of them are more kind of sort of philosophical, but one of the biggest ones is just filling the awkward pause. We all know about those little silences that you'll have in a conversation with someone, right? You meet somebody, you shake hands at a conference. How are you? Where are you from? How many kids do you have? There's a little weird pause, and everybody gets those little butterflies because we don't like pauses. And so you end up filling it. And journalists are actually taught this. I can tell you that because I was taught this in journalism school. They said, look, if you're doing an interview with someone and they're giving you these high level corporate messages that are not really serving your audience really well, inject one of those little weird pauses and it kind of reboots or resets the person's brain. And so what they end up doing is improvising, ad-libbing. They'll come up with something that's maybe a little bit more interesting. So that's number one. I think only saying your most important messages once is a mistake as far as I'm concerned. Like, you don't want to be like a politician where you just repeat the same thing over and over and over again. Nobody wants to see that. But if you have let's say two really important points you want to get across, try to deliver them up slightly different ways with a different statistic, a different example, a different analogy. So over the course of a 10 or 15-minute interview, you might introduce those two ideas a couple different ways. And so that's a big one. My favorite that I see all the time, and you don't even have to take my word for this, people will see this and hear this in the media every single day. It's repeating the journalist's language in your answer. So the journalist, you're in the middle of an interview and the journalist asks you something like, how much of a nightmare is this for you and your leadership team? Now you might think like, oh my God, like what? It's not a nightmare at all. But most people will still use that word in their response. They would say, well, I wouldn't say it's been a nightmare. Actually, I think we've done a really good job. And let me tell you the 3 reasons why. What they don't realize is when the interview's over, the journalist is going to go back to their notes and that quote just jumps off the page. And so that's going to be one of your 2 or 3 quotes. Even though you're refuting it, our human brain, all we see is that word nightmare and all the connotations of it. So if you're going to tell your story, tell it with your words. Number 4 would be just generically a lack of preparation. So many executives or spokespeople that will just get a media request and just start talking, which is like, if the journalist has done more homework than you're probably not setting yourself up for success. So carve out 20, 30 minutes to prepare. in a really focused way, and with a lot of these other tips in there as well. And finally, to wrap it up, I would say poor message creation, like poor, just lackluster content. And so you can have all the tips and the tricks, and you can follow all the great media training people and read all the books. All of those tips are useless if your content sucks. And so invest the time to tell a story that resonates with your audience and it's true and transparent and all those other things. But, I could go on. You probably get the idea. I could talk about this for 3 hours, but to me, if I had to boil it down to 5, those would be my top 5.
Those awkward pauses, those get public information officers all the time. They don't like them. And like you said, you just feel like you have to ad lib. And I would get reporters that would call me, especially from the Chicago media. There's always kind of this underlying tone where they're trying to catch you in saying something that, you're hiding something. They're trying to get you that. And I would sit there and I would just be quiet. And after a while, they're like, you didn't answer my question. I said, you didn't ask one. And so it would go back and forth that way. So I had a lot of fun with a few of the reporters that would try the awkward pause regularly. For me, it didn't work very well. But I will agree with you about the starting out with, or I should say, doing your research, because God, if you get a phone cold call, especially during like sweeps week, where they're calling you out of the blue and that, we're doing a story. Well, what's going on nationally? I start looking around to see what other news stations are doing or what kind of writing that reporter does too. So that's kind of your background. You want to know if they're doing hit pieces on your public information group, whatever organization you're with, or your private sector group.
Oh, for sure.
So you are a proponent for making great presentations. What do you think are some of the tips on how we can improve on making those presentations?
So a media training session is really a presentation, right? And I stopped counting after somewhere over 1,000. I've been in this business, like I'd say approaching 30 years. And once you get to a certain level, I started to get asked to do presentation training sessions because people are asking me, like, how come you don't use any notes? And why do you seem so comfortable and conversational? And I have to say that there's a video of me out there somewhere in my first presentation training session where I was the participant, and I was petrified. My face was red. I was hyperventilating. And so I really empathize with people who, Jerry Seinfeld had that line that people's biggest fear, they did a poll, right? And people's biggest fear was public speaking. And so he said, number 2 was death. So if someone's at a funeral, by that logic, they would rather be the person in the coffin than the one giving the eulogy. So I always found that sort of funny. And so I really try to give people tools and techniques to just make it a little more palatable, a little more manageable. And ultimately it comes down to, again, prep and times at bat, putting homework into your story, empathizing with your audience. I think one of the most powerful things you can do is really, before you open up PowerPoint or start working on content, is try to envision the presentation, not from your eyeballs at the front of the room. Try to envision it from the person sitting in the back row, right? Why are they there? What is keeping them up at night about this topic? How can you help them level up with a skill or a topic, or what are some 3 ideas you can give them? And so I really find when you try to put yourself in the mindset of the person who is going to be receiving the information, and then have some fun with it, right? Like, if I looked at my presentation, you know how you can look at your PowerPoint presentation, you can see all the slides at once on a screen, right? You have that sort of bird's eye view. 10 years ago, I'm ashamed to say that most of my presentation was just words on pages, words on slides. And every year I make a habit of, it's usually around the holidays, I kind of blow up last year's version and I kind of reinvent it. And it's the same principles, but I try to make it more interesting. And today I would say that it's much more visual based, example based videos. And that takes effort, right? To look for these things and to source them and record them and put them in. And you have this gigantic file, but ultimately you have something that's more interesting for the audience member. And the final thing is practice with it, right? Practice at home, read it out, videotape yourself, time yourself. Going over time is one of the cardinal sins of presentations. And so having all those things going in your mind at the same time is tough. And so practice, prep, watch people who do it really well, whether it's a Steve Jobs keynote introducing the iPhone or the iPad. He was a master at this, right? He wasn't always. If you look back at the 1980s, Steve Jobs was not a great presenter. He was not great at media interviews, but he made the time to prep and prepare. And so if he can do it, I really believe that anybody can. So those are just a couple of tips off the top of my head.
Yeah, presentation skills are tough for people, and over the pandemic, when we since this pandemic started, we've gone to virtual a lot.
Yeah.
Now you really got to step up your game, because now you don't have that face-to-face interaction, and the public sector, with law enforcement, fire, having to deliver presentations virtually, that can be very tough, and you want to get as much content out there, but you forget that people their eyes gloss over when all they see are words and letters. I mean, it doesn't really help. And I agree, telling this story early on and getting them engaged in what you're going to talk about. And I found that I have upped my game a lot with my presentations, where very few bullet points. It's really more about the imagery and using examples than actually throwing content onto a screen with, the old standard bullet points. So
get those synapses firing, right? Make their brains light up.
Exactly. And I used to talk about that with kids when I used to do presentations with kids, is you could always see when you hit them with the right thing, because you literally did see their eyeballs just, whoa.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do for adults too. And we forget that sometimes.
We're just big kids.
Yeah, exactly. Crisis communication, the very big things that are in the field for public information officers, for communications professionals. What are the skills are key for a public sector communications professional in crisis comms?
This is an interesting one, and again, it's a topic I'm sure we can talk about for hours. It's one of those areas where I personally believe that you need to have the muscles built up before, right? And not to simplify this, and I'm certainly not a scientist, but what I find fascinating about a crisis is, and I always joke that anyone in the communications or media relations field, we all turn into Simon Cowell from American Idol when there's a crisis on, right? Like, you're sitting there crossing your arms and watching who are they going to roll out and what are they going to say, and we're parsing every word, whether it's Alec Baldwin or some other person in the midst of these things. And so we have that fight or flight instinct, right? Our reptile brain, that little piece inside of our brain with the amygdala, right? And so we have a crisis takes place, and what ends up happening is your brain is just trying to get you out of this situation. And so what ends up happening is you have these otherwise intelligent, empathetic, considerate, thoughtful people, these leaders, who the best parts of their brain get shut off, really, or relegated to the back seat. And so we end up making panic decisions. And there was a train derailment in Canada in 2013. It was the news story of the year here. I don't know if any of your listeners would be familiar with this, but you can look it up. It's called Lac-Mégantic. There was this town in Quebec where horrible accident. This train full of oil tanker cars went down a hill, sort of runaway train, exploded. 47 people were killed. The town was just devastated. And I watched with kind of horror. I watched as the chair of the board did a series of interviews with news outlet after outlet after outlet after outlet. And he was just making it up on the fly, and just that empathy piece just was not evident, right? I don't think this is a bad guy. I'm sure that this is an intelligent, thoughtful, empathetic man. He just had the best parts of his brain turned off because this was the most stressful time in his life. And so the lesson is, it's like insurance, right? You want to have those muscles, have the crisis plan, do the training, do the simulations. And it sounds boring, and, it's time consuming, and it can be expensive and everything else. But I can tell you personally that I've worked with a series of companies who have, every 2 years, they'll do these simulations, and you've full day of training and full, people calling in and fake disasters and messaging and interviews and responses. And those companies, when the what hits the fan, they handle it so much better. And so I think the skills, go to Google, like how do you handle a crisis? The skills are the commodity. It's getting them in place ahead of time. And so if there's one lesson, it would be really to invest in those. Like I used to give presentations at conferences back before we got stuck in this, pandemic Zoom land that we've been in for almost 2 years now. And I'd be at the front of the room and I would ask the audience, how many of you, let's say there's 200 people in the audience. I'd say, how many of you have, for your organization, you have a crisis plan or crisis communications plan, it's up to date and you know where it is? How many people? And the most hands I ever saw was 6 out of like 200 people. And so back in the days before the pandemic, everybody's not everybody, but most people's crisis management plan was hope. We hope it doesn't happen to us, right? And most years they were rewarded because most years it didn't happen to them. And then all of a sudden, everybody's in a crisis. And you saw this at the beginning of the pandemic with all these different companies just scrambling and trying to figure it out. And we've been in, we're up to our eyeballs in crisis mode now for 2 years. But the biggest lesson to me is invest in those skills, do the training, build up those muscles before you need them.
You can't say any more than hope is not a strategy. That's the line I've always remembered, right? It's not. All right. So what needs to be done in the first few hours of a crisis?
Acknowledge it. First of all, the first place I will go if a large scale organization is having a crisis or a small scale one, I could think of, I don't know if you remember the story from this past summer, the guy from the clothing boutique who emailed the young person, like she had applied for a job and to be like a model for their company. It was called Ava Lane Boutique. I don't know if you remember this at all, but it was like last July. And this young woman sent in an email with a picture of herself to be a model for the company. And it's a husband and wife team that run this company. And he sent a note. He wanted to send the note to his wife saying, I don't know if we should hire her. She's not that pretty. And instead of sending it to the wife, he sent it back to the girl and she put it on TikTok and it became this big viral story. Right. And so it doesn't need to be an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. It can be a little thing with your business. But the first place I go is Twitter. So what is the company doing? What are they saying? Like, are they on top of it? And it speaks to those muscles we just referred to earlier, right? If you see a void, then I think we have a problem. I think of the shooting in Las Vegas with the concert at Mandalay Bay. Yeah. MGM and Mandalay Bay, it was clear to me that they had their act together because and obviously, large organizations like this in their business, they invested the time and the money to build those skills. And if you look at their Twitter page, they had constant updates, acknowledging the situation, providing information, counselors made available, 800 numbers, websites, talking about the actions, customers, employees, all the things that they were doing. They communicated quickly and they communicated consistently. And then I compare that with, or contrast it with, like Boeing, for example. And this is a company that I've been rather hard on because they, when that second plane crashed, I went to their Twitter page and this is a multi-billion dollar publicly traded massive company. And there was nothing. And eventually when they ended up putting out a statement, well, I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but it was basically like a PowerPoint slide. And on the slide said, our hearts go out to the victims of this tragedy, but these are amazing airplanes. Even in the second line, they were kind of talking about how great the airplanes were. And I'm like, that's a clue. It goes to leadership. Right. And so to me, you acknowledge the situation and you have to tell the truth the first time, right? Tell the truth the first time. The public will forgive anything as bad as it is, as long as you don't try to deceive them. That's the one thing that they won't forgive.
I agree with you on that. It's so important to acknowledge it. And I watch so many incidents where if you want to really go back to the shooting that happened in Ferguson, where their Twitter page was non-existent, their presence on social media was almost non-existent. It took them a full, I think, 4.5 days before they even had a public statement. Wow. And unfortunately, it just creates this the void. And who's going to fill the void but the voices from the other side? And if you don't react and you don't have something prepared, or you don't even have the presence to do it, it just really opens you up to deeper problems.
Yeah, for sure.
So how can a public sector communications pro, how can they begin developing their communications plan?
I would start at Google. I think back in the olden days, it would sound like one of the grumpy Muppet guys, but back in the old days, everything was so expensive. You'd bring in consultants, and this is 20,000, and that's 70,000. Go to Google. Some of the best templates I've seen for communications plans are like 6 or 7 pages long, and scroll through, find one you like. To me, a usable communications plan is short. It's not going to be one of those big, thick binders. Those are always covered in dust on the shelf, right?
Nobody knows where they're at.
And who has time to go through it? So, have a contact list. Who's available? Who's on the team? What's our approach? Maybe to figure out ahead of time, what are the types of decisions we're going to make as an organization if X happens, and to make those decisions in advance. Like I bring up a company like, I don't know if are you familiar with Gymshark, the clothing company from the UK?
No.
You will be familiar with them, and if you don't know them, if you have kids or anyone that has kids will be familiar with them. And I'm seeing their stuff all over the place, but I think $400 or $500 million in annual revenues, like just the company's just blowing up. And they had an issue on Black Friday. I think it was in 2015. They were just starting out as a company, and they had a situation where their servers crashed and people couldn't make sales, or there was just a chaos going on with their online store. People were paying for stuff and not getting it, and people were getting the wrong things. And mishandled, that would be something that could have killed the company. And what ended up happening is the founder of the company is a guy named Ben Francis, excellent user of social media. I think he's in his mid-20s right now, and he's been running the company for better part of a decade. He sat down and wrote 2,500 handwritten apology notes to every single person who had an errant transaction. Every single person. Wasn't like something was printed up and he signed it, or one of those little robot pens. He sat in a room, his arm must have been falling off. But that to me speaks to, like, this is a guy 10 years, 15 years from now, we're going to be speaking about this guy the way we do about Steve Jobs. I guarantee it. And I'm glad that we're putting this on tape, but those are the seeds of excellence, right? How many CEOs would do that? How many founders would do that? And so doing the right thing and saying the right thing are always the approach. But again, go to Google, find a template, fill it out, make it easy, make it actionable, find out what ask around to organizations that might have a good plan in place, copy, steal, use theirs, apply it for yours. You don't have to spend a lot of money. I don't think you have to spend any money for this.
Right. And then you have to you got to practice it and put it to, and have training for it, because otherwise it's useless, because when it does happen, you're going to go, well, what do I do? Right.
Like I have a book about how to play the guitar, but that doesn't help. You got to pick up the guitar. You got to play.
You got to actually pluck the strings. Exactly. Yeah. So what are some things, I'm sorry, can you provide some examples of where a public sector communications professional could improve?
I feel reluctant to give advice to public communications professionals. Like I think I'm connected to so many of them online. Like I think they're doing a pretty good job. I think I follow these individuals. I listen to a lot of their podcasts. I listen to yours now. I don't think I have a lot of advice to give to these people. I'm not some Yoda figure, right? I'm still learning like everybody else.
We're all learning. Yeah.
When it comes to my sweet spot, like media training, I think I could probably add some value here and there. But for the rest of the stuff, I'm just listening like everybody else. And so I guess if I were to say philosophically, the one thing that I'm by no means a spring chicken in this business, but I consider myself youthful in terms of my approach and my openness to embrace new things, whether it's social media or just modes of communication. I'm trying not to get atrophied in a lot of the old school ways. And so try to keep current on those things. And because everything's always changing, but to me, it would be adaptable, look at what's going on out there, try to see what skills you can take from people. And social media has been fantastic for that, because you can connect with people. Some of my best friends now, I haven't actually met in real life. They're Twitter people that I just from this world, because you feel like kindred spirits with these people, even though they might live, thousands of miles away.
I agree. So let's talk social media now, since you brought it up.
Great segue.
It's awesome. I appreciate it. How important is it to have a plan for developing your social media content?
I guess it depends on your organization. I think that overly planned is kind of boring. If you have to get executive approval for every post and every tweet that's going to be sent out, that leads to lackluster content. But then if you have people just freewheeling it, like I don't know if you saw what Pabst Blue Ribbon sent out a couple days ago, like just that to me is totally offside, inappropriate. They ended up pulling it. It's not a good look. So generically, like I can speak for myself. I'm a one-person business. I do work with some subcontractors, but for the most part, I'm a one-person business. And the way I treat Twitter is probably about 92% business and crisis tips and media interviews. You're not going to see my kids on there. You're not going to see much about my personal life. Maybe if I'm out for a hike or something with my dog or a car or that I'm working on or whatever, but to me, that's my generic plan, right? Like there's kind of a line, stuff that I will share, stuff that I won't share. We all have that individual in our life who we're in our feed who shares every single thing, every thought they have, every meal they have, every political opinion that they have. And I think you don't want to be that person. I guess the most value I could probably add with this one is if I think of something like long-term care facilities, right? Retirement homes. They've been really rocked over the past couple of years. They were in a crisis beforehand, especially here in Canada, but they've been really rocked over the course of the pandemic. And I've been telling a lot of these individuals because they're getting terrible media coverage, but also because they're terrible at media relations. They're not calling the reporters back. They're being deceptive or they're being defensive. And that turns into bad media coverage. And so I'm saying, go straight to the source, put it on your Facebook page, make a video, put it on YouTube for your audience. And they just, all the blood drains out of their face. They're terrified by this prospect. And I say, look, if you have this audience built up ahead of time, you can activate it. You don't need to go to the media. You can go straight to the source. So I think social media is going to be increasingly important as time goes on. And it's really key for organizations to do it again in a transparent, truthful, empathetic way. Don't try to game it. There's no tactic that's going to scam the algorithm. I'm very proud that every follower that I have is one that's a real person that's out there somewhere, right? There's no bots in Russia. These are real people. So I could have a larger audience, but to what end? So to me, it's about being genuine, being transparent, building that audience, and then using them. So you don't have to do an interview with a local TV station. If you don't want to, you can go straight to your audience.
Right. And that's where I was going with delivering that content is you can't always have pre-planned content. You've got to kind of make it's got to be organic in
Right.
some sense or form, but you also can't have just one person approving that content because it becomes stale after a while.
Yeah.
And it's the same format all the time instead of, hey, I can get, especially in a big organization, you can rely on a younger demographic in your organization to give you some tips on things to do. I think that's where TikTok has surpassed YouTube now for people jumping onto it because it's got that everybody's on there now. I don't think there's any age group that's not represented there.
Yeah. TikTok is great. They've really nailed the algorithm in terms of just keeping you, as soon as you go in there, boom, there's a video and there's another one. And the more you use it, the better it gets at predicting what you like. It's kind of scary, actually.
It's very scary how the rabbit hole of TikTok. I mean, you can get on it and I'll scroll through a couple of videos. A half hour later, you're like, whoa, where did the time go?
Yeah.
So where do you see social media going in the future?
Man, I think if I were more tech savvy, I think that there's a large trend toward decentralization. Like I see that, when platforms like Twitter and YouTube start banning people, to me, that's a bit of a slippery slope where, I'm a big believer in free speech. We don't have that sort of amendment here in Canada. Unfortunately, we have different free speech laws, but I'm a huge believer in it. And that ultimately the best speech wins out. So I think if we look 10 years down the road, I don't know what it's going to be, but I think there's going to be pockets of more decentralized social media tools that people will be using. Again, if I were that smart, I would invent them, but I'm not. I was an English major, not a computer science guy. But I do believe that the tools that we have are going to be increasingly important for organizations to use to connect with their audiences. the traditional media is just getting ravaged, and it makes me sad because I grew up wanting to be a journalist. I have a sister who's a national health reporter here. And every week I see friends who have worked in the media for 10, 20, 25 years who are going over to other industries because it's a sinking ship. The revenues are disappearing, the clickbait, the polarization of everything. And so what's going to be left at the end of the day are those social media channels for you to be able to, like I said, the first place I go isn't the New York Times, not CNN, it's Twitter. Right. And so I really believe that those tools are going to be increasingly important. The tools may change 10, 15, 20 years from now. It might not be Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. It might be something else. But going straight to your audiences is going to become increasingly important in my view anyway.
That's a great way to close out the main part of our questions. Thank you very much, Warren. Appreciate it. All right, so let's go to some rapid fire questions.
Sure.
Favorite drink of choice?
It's a toss up between coffee, which I'm drinking one right now, and single malt whiskey.
I got my coffee, and I am a huge whiskey drinker. I actually gave my daughter, I make old fashions, and that's my thing. Yeah. And I gave my daughter for Christmas, I gave her an old fashioned kit. She's 24 and she's a digital producer for an NBC station.
Oh, nice.
So I did the whole little card with everything on how to make it, how I make it. And the other day she sends me a picture of her little bar cart set up with the instructions on it, and then her holding an old fashioned. She goes, Genius. I got it right. Yes, it was awesome.
It's a great dad moment.
Oh yeah, it was. Great. So what do you do to relax?
To relax, I have to say, I have, since the pandemic started, I've been trying to teach myself to play the guitar. And this is something I started about 25 years ago, and, got married, had kids, had no time. And so it just sat in the corner, and I've been, it's been a real joy for me to do that. So I'm trying to do a half hour a day, the consistent approach over long term. I still am pretty awful, but I find that it puts your mind in a completely different mode from work and everything else. So that's the biggest thing. The other one would be watching YouTube videos. I rarely watch TV anymore. I go down into these rabbit holes, and I've been watching like a lot of guitar stuff, but Stevie Ray Vaughan is a guy that I've discovered over the last couple of years. I always knew he existed, but just a new appreciation for the level of skill. And so what's cool is that you can go back and watch concerts from, 1985, 1989, and just really, really cool. So those are my two big ones.
Nice. Chocolate or vanilla?
Chocolate, of course. What kind of psychopath likes vanilla?
What is a must-read book in your mind?
I've got my kind of, if there's one book that I would try to get my kids to read, I don't know if they're ready for it yet. They're like just in high school, but Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And I know that's kind of like a pretentious-y kind of answer, but I find a lot of this wisdom in this book is just so timeless. So that's my sort of my kind of highbrow answer. The book I read most recently that I really, really, really enjoyed was The Storyteller by Dave Grohl, the guy from Foo Fighters. Okay. And who would think that, a guy from the grunge movement would write a great book, but it's fantastic. I actually listened to the audiobook, and so you hear it in his voice, and it was really, really great. But he had this he talks about being really young, like 7 or 8 years old, and being in his bedroom and kind of envisioning his career being that rock star on stage with, thousands of fans. And he kind of manifested that. And so that's a theme that I see comes up with a lot of successful people, is they have this moment of clarity and they kind of envision it and they work towards it. And so a lot of great stories in there. And I think overall, it kind of reinforces that picture where you want to go, work really hard, and you can get there. So that was, so Marcus Aurelius and Dave Grohl. I probably can't find two more different folks.
Right. Talk about different spectrums.
Yeah.
I'm actually reading The Revolt of the Public by Martin Gurry.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, good book. But I'm still working through that. That was suggested by somebody else, so that's one of mine. If you could have coffee with one historic figure, who would you choose?
My historic figure is still alive, but he does qualify. And I don't know if you'd be familiar with this guy. You may, given your line of work, you might. But does the name Clint Hill resonate with you? Do you know who that is?
It sounds familiar.
He was He is the Secret Service agent from the JFK
Oh,
assassination.
yes, I do know. Yes. Okay. Very good.
So he's the guy who jumped on the back of the car when Jackie O was trying to get out. And fortunately, I don't even know how this happened, but I got to interview him a year ago for my podcast. So we talked for an hour, and I had to send so many emails to try to get a hold of this guy. But I would love, even after I think we hit an hour. And this is the guy he was in the car. He was in the hospital room with the autopsy. Like, this is so, and I'm fascinated by the whole JFK thing. And I don't know if you've seen Oliver Stone had a documentary that just came out recently, just very, very, very compelling stuff, and the whole conspiracy theory. So I would love to have coffee with that guy. And he's 90 years old, but completely with it. I think I did like 40 hours of research, the most I've ever done for an interview. And he actually corrected me on 3 little factual details. And so, I can only hope to be half that with it when I'm 90 years old. Hopefully if I get to the point.
Yeah, I feel like I forgot what happened yesterday, and yet he's remembering something goes back.
Who would you want to have coffee with?
Who would I like to have coffee with? Honestly, I actually think of the people I'd like to meet is Winston Churchill. I'd like to sit down and interview Winston Churchill.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
fascinating guy. The baths, the painting, just the
historic part of what he did, what he was involved in, and just a perspective that I wouldn't normally take, but for me that would be him.
Fascinating. Good answer.
What would be your superpower if you could get one?
It's a strange question.
I know.
I think, like, I don't know. People usually say I like to be able to fly or whatever. I think it would be cool to be able to talk to dogs. Find out what dogs are saying. I think because dogs are like the best creatures in the world, loyal companions. They're just, I don't know, they're so kind-hearted. And I'd love to be able to talk to dogs if that was a superpower.
I think I'd like to know what my dog says half the time when she's giving me that look. There's always that kind of, or
like, what do you want to eat? Do you like this stuff? Because she doesn't seem to like, I keep trying different foods and she's like looking at me, and I'd love to be able to know what's going on in that little head.
I love it. That's a great, I'd love to have that one. All right, Warren. So final thoughts, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that's, thanks very much for having me on. It's been a fun chat.
I really appreciate you coming on. So how can people best reach out to you?
So Twitter's probably the best way. Warren_Weeks on Twitter, or weeksmedia.ca. That's pretty much it.
I will add all that into the show notes.
Thanks so much.
Warren Weeks from Weeks Media. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, and have a great 2022.
Same to you, sir.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at thepiopodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get notified of the latest episode. If you are listening on a platform that allows reviews, please give us a review. We appreciate any review, good or bad. It helps us improve on each episode. Until next time, be safe.